Can anybody hear me? How about Mario? Can you hear me?
I can't figure out how they could answer you if they didn't hear you.
I didn't hear you. What did you say?
Well, I guess you'll have to be quiet.
Don, why don't you go?
It wasn't plugged in. No, I was plugged in with the rest of it. Is this it? Yeah. Okay. All right. What I just want to do is see if actually either of you want to respond to the other. But then I just want to open the floor for questions, and I'll try to see all the hands or phrases. Well, let's just do that. Shall we? Okay, you.
Say something.
Okay, well, I was going to point to one of the audience members.
You want to point to the audience for
Questions for
Okay.
the people who are sitting up here.
I have a question for Mario.
You're always trying to play it both ways.
Why aren't you president of the United States?
I think. Whoa. This is not good for lying. I think a better question is if you were the president of the United States now, what would you do in Pakistan? And are you glad you're president? No, really, I think the important questions now are, here's one so basic that we don't even get to it, and I'd be particularly interested in your response to it. Everybody's talking about the war in Pakistan, the war in Afghanistan. There is no war. Nobody's ever declared war. The Constitution says war must be declared, and if it's to be declared, it has to be by the Congress. Of course, we've ignored that since the Second World War. Do this for fun. You know, when they don't like your question, they really let you know. So the Constitution says that the Congress must declare war. A whole series of weak Congresses and very strong presidents have produced a situation where they've literally ignored the law. They did it in Iraq, they did it in Vietnam, they did it in various military actions, and now they're about to do it again in Afghanistan. Just ignore the Constitution. And when you ask them, well, what explains this? Is, well, it hasn't been followed since the Second World War. And the answer to that is you cannot amend the Constitution by persistent violation of it. You can't say, I violated it for all this time, you lose your. Now, if then you look at the Constitution, what should happen now is that the Congress should address this issue. And the Congress should say whether we should send 40,000 troops or 30,000 troops or 20,000 troops. And as a practical matter, the president then could volunteer so that people couldn't say he was running away from the decision. The president could say, look, I'll give you my opinion, and this is it. Now you tell me what your opinion is because you are the men and women who are supposed to declare war. And that way you'd have both of them implicated here, and a better chance that we'd get a good answer. If you leave it up to, but nobody wants to talk about that issue.
And I think the reason that's so important is that the wars that have been fought in Iraq and Afghanistan have been essentially fought by our soldiers and not by the country at large. I mean, I kept thinking after September 11th that it was one of those moments like Pearl Harbor where our president would call upon the people of the country to sacrifice whatever was going to be done to deal. Oh, I'll just hold this thing. Obviously, is that better? Mine's not working. What was that?
We need a new sound system. We need a brand new sound system. I've been saying it for years. Anyway,
This is
what were
getting
you
intimate.
saying before you were so rudely interrupted?
Now, can you hear me? Anyway, what I was saying is that this is getting intimate. Can you hear me okay now? I have a loud voice anyway, my mother used to say, so I'll just use the voice whether this works or not. What happened after September 11th was we thought it would have been those moments when a president would have called upon the country. Should I go up to what should we do?
Take my mic. I'm not saying it.
Okay. This will work. Oh, yes. We'll just share. That's a very good way to do it. And anyhow, after September 11th, as some of you here know, my son was one of those, many, who decided to do something when the country seemed in peril. And he had graduated from Harvard in June of '01, and in history and literature with never a moment's thought of the Army. And on September 12th, he went and volunteered for the Army. And he thought there would be thousands more like him. But at that time, Mr. Rumsfeld wanted a smaller, more mobile Army, so they didn't enlarge the Army. And so what has happened over these last years of those two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is the same soldiers have had to fight it over and over again. My son served 4 years in Iraq. He got a Bronze Star. He came out, got to throw out the first ball at Fenway Park, which he said was more exciting even scarier than his 4 years in Iraq. Came home, was working in a terrific job, got called back from inactive ready reserve, and had another year in Afghanistan. It was all right for him because he wasn't yet married and he could do it, and it turned out to be an extraordinary experience. But many of his friends who got called back were married, had little children, lost their relationships with their family, being called back again and again. So I think Mario's right. If the Congress had to make this decision, and the Congress is responsive to the people, and the people are going to fight a war, you can't put it on the backs of our soldiers. It has to be an entire country that's fighting that war. Even when my kid was over in Iraq, he had unarmored Humvees because we weren't able to get factories working 24-hour a day like we did in World War II. In World War II, we were able to produce, at the beginning of the war, it took 365 days to produce a single cargo ship. They needed cargo ships so desperately to get the troops across and to get our supplies across to Europe. So by 1941, they got it down to 200 days, by 1942 to 100 days, by 1943 to a single day to produce a cargo ship. People worked in shipyards and airplane factories round the clock at 3 shifts a day, producing what our soldiers needed. None of that work has been done in our country to support our soldiers. We pay attention to the war, sort of. We read about people dying. It's a little bit in the papers. It doesn't even get the same attention that the 3,000 people who died in 9/11 get. They got individual biographies in the New York Times, which our soldiers have not gotten. So I really think you're onto something there. When a war has to be fought, the country has to fight it. And I hope for President Obama's sake, as he deliberates about what to do, whatever decision he makes, he has to realize that if we are going to commit a lot of troops, if we're going to commit more treasure, then this entire country has to be willing to sacrifice for many years to make it happen. If we're not, and he can't, then we better not do what they're thinking of doing.
The race problem. What's really happening
in this country right now. The anti-black movement that is the what? Stop moving my fingers. The race movement, the race issue. It's blatant, and it's getting worse. And we have the right wing that is of the Republican Party, the Conservative Party. There is no Conservative Party, but there more or less isn't. But there's a conservative movement of the Republican Party which is exacerbating this to such a degree that you know the old issues of black shame, the cartoons, the blackness of Obama being a comic ploy. I don't know. I wonder what you make of this in American racial history, and what do you think is going to happen?
First of all, the race question is a subtle one, because we are, I guess, the only nation in world history, I don't know that any is even close, that was made up the way we were, except for the Native Americans whom we slaughtered and abused. We were made up by bringing people from all over the globe, of different ethnicities, different colors, all kinds. And so we started with this tremendous diversity, and we've never reduced the amount of diversity because they continue to come. Different races, different people. And our culture is created by them. I mean, if you think of an American culture that literally believed in the melting pot. I always thought of the melting pot as a kind of absurd suggestion. What do? Take me from Sorrento and throw me into this boiling cauldron and it melts away my distinctions? If you threw everybody into a melting pot and melted away their ethnicity, what would you have left? What would the ideal American be? So it's a product of diversity. Now, the diversity has two aspects to it. Even animals, most of them, are afraid of other animals that aren't exactly like them, and they sniff them, and they have to check them out. And so the differences suggest a kind of caution and sometimes hostility. You're black, I'm white, you're Greek, I'm Italian, etc. And that's what we have to get over. And we've suffered with that from the very beginning. If you're Italians and you came from my neighborhood with parents like mine, you still feel the pain of hearing them referred to as guineas, dagos, wops, greaseballs. I mean, that's language that came from stupid people. The Mick, you know, the Polish guy who's stupid because he's Polish. I mean, the ideal picture of the early movies, I'll never forget it. Jimmy Cagney is in a room. All right, so you have the Irish guy, George Raft. This is in a cell. It was Jimmy Cagney, who was Irish. It was George Raft, who was supposed to be Italian. It was a black guy with a banjo playing "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen." You know, that was the stereotype. Okay. Now, what about racism? Well, we know racism. You say racism, you're talking about blacks, basically. Well, we drag them here from Africa. You know, it's an embarrassment we still have to live with, and it's a problem. Obama helps considerably because he is perceived as a member of that race. Actually, if it were 30 years ago, you'd be referring to him probably as a mulatto when you use language like mulatto and mestizo and mezclada to describe these different blendings. But the black people and the Negroes are pleased to have him represent them. And that's a very good thing because he is brilliant, he's eloquent, and he's your president. And that has helped us. But now the racism is taking another form. You've got 1 billion Muslims and maybe, I don't know, 100,000 jihadists who are the killer Muslims who are evil. But all those Muslims pay for those 100 jihadists, because there is this temptation to say, Muslims are the people of 9/11. It's something we have to struggle against. We were born with it as a problem. It continues to be a problem, and it's a matter of intelligence and instruction. No matter what else you try, I think what has to happen is that people rise up in their, whatever color they are, whatever, and achieve areas of respect and wealth and acceptance. But it's a problem. It's a real problem. The bigger problem is not color, frankly, it's poverty. In this country, I haven't heard mentioned by anybody, not the liberals, what's left of them, or anybody else. We have more poor people today than we had 10 years ago. We have more poor people, more children, like those kids in South Jamaica that grow up familiar with the sound of gunfire before they've ever heard an orchestra play. We have more of them, children at risk, and we don't even talk about them. I don't even hear them mentioned in the nightly news. So, do we have a problem with racial differences? Yes, we were born to the problem. Are we making progress? Yes, especially when we get help the way Obama gives us help by being a great human being. Are we working hard at dealing with it? No.
Let's go to the floor, and our time is relatively brief. Uh-oh. Here we go again. Okay, guys.
Mine is the only one that works. Go.
Why they took? Oh.
I guess there you go. This is still working, I guess. Okay.
You got both of them?
Test one, two. Test one, two.
You want to try that one, Doris?
Can you pull that one up?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
Is this
well,
work? Oh, yes.
I forgot what the question was.
I remember it. We seem to be living in a time of real divisiveness, and is there hope for the future? It does seem to me, I mean, I'm sure people who were living in the 1850s would argue, no way, that was much more divisive than now. But for those of us who've lived in the last 50 years or so, there is a bitterness to the political dialogue that I really haven't seen in a while. I think part of it has to do with the fact that at least even 20, 30, 40 years ago, people who were Republicans and Democrats in the Congress weren't running home every weekend to raise the funds to those idiotic amounts of money they have to spend to be on television to win elections. And as a result, they stayed together. They played poker, they drank on the weekends, they formed friendships across party lines. So that, for example, in 1964, when LBJ had to turn to the Republicans to break the filibuster on the Civil Rights Bill to desegregate the South, because he knew he couldn't get the Southern Democrats to break it. He needed Republicans. He could go to Everett Dirksen, with whom he'd formed already a friendship. He could, of course, promise him everything under the sun, every public works project, every dam, every bridge would be in the state of Illinois, sinking the state of Illinois. But then he could say to him, Everett, you come with me on this bill, and you know there was that big statue to old Abe Lincoln at the World's Fair. If you come with me on this bill, I'll build you a much bigger statue of your own. And then indeed, if you come with me on this bill, 200 years from now, school children will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. And Dirksen brought 22 Republicans to join the 44 Northern Democrats to break that filibuster, the first time ever broken on a civil rights bill, and bring that historic bill to the floor. You don't have those kind of people now that are willing to make those compromises in the Congress and the Senate, who have those friendships across party line. And then you add to that too many of our districts have been so devised so that people have a single party that knows it's going to win. And you add to that, the television likes the loudest voices to argue against one another. So they give too much airtime to the idiotic things that the stupidest idiotic people say. And then they feel happy being on television, so they say even more idiotic things. So taken together, it is a scary phenomena. The only reason I have hope for the future, and I have no way of reasoning why I do, but as a Brooklyn Dodger fan and then a Red Sox fan, I had to have hope in really desperate times. And eventually, my teams won the World Series.
You're right. Do you wanna...
I think what's happened really is not so much a difference in political ideology as a new simplistic view of the issues. For example, one of them that I'm very fond of mentioning is big government, little government. It's an absurdity to talk in terms of big government, little government. All those people who say they're against big government, let's take the Republican conservatives who have said it for years. All the Republican conservative presidents were guilty of very big government. Reagan had one of the biggest military budgets ever. That's big government. You go to John Kennedy decides to spend limitless amounts of money on going to the moon. That's big government. Eisenhower decides on a highway program to build highways for the whole United States. The only state that wasn't part of that highway program was New York, because we had done it before that program. But all the rest, so it's the simplistics that we have to war against. People who talk about big government, little government. Just say socialistic, and you can get votes. Social medicine, that's an absurd, socialized medicine, that's another absurdity. What are you saying, that if government does it, it's wrong? What about education? Public school education, is that socialized education? God forbid. So I think that's the problem. I handle it this way myself, and I always have. I say there is a place for ideology in policymaking, but it is not first place. First place should go to common sense and benign pragmatism. It has to make sense, and it has to, I say benign pragmatism because my name is Mario Cuomo. If I left out the benign and just said pragmatism, people would think of Machiavelli. And they think Machiavelli is bad, which he wasn't. The princes he was talking about were bad, but not Machiavelli. But I think it should come down, and that's the way people like Tarki, Lombardi, who was a Republican, yes, and there were certain basic drifts that he had, but you don't answer every question that way. The thing that you try to be on every issue is common sensible, and it's got to work to the benefit of the people. If that happens, and look, that's what you're forced to be in moments of great urgency. Take the economy. We fell into this terrible, terrible recession. Forget about how we did. It was it threatened us fundamentally. What happened to all those people who said government shouldn't be spending too much money when Obama said, now we've got to spend billions, trillions of dollars in order to make up for the lack of consumption? If you didn't do that, you'd be dead economically. And so people aren't making that point anymore. Why? Because it doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So I think what we should be striving for is things that make sense. There is a place for ideology. I think I have a special sensitivity to immigrants and a special desire to see immigrants worked in. I have a special concern still about women. There are still inequities there, but they're general. They're not, a formula for solving all the problems. Look, from the very beginning, the founding fathers, I guess now Doris would know this probably better than I, Washington was against parties. Madison was against parties. And they said, look, if you're going to have parties, you're starting by separating people immediately. You're forcing them to disagree with one another. And to some extent, I think that's right. Look at where the United States is now. You have as many independents, the last time I looked, as you have liberals and conservatives put together. 50% independents, 25. So now half the country says the hell with those two labels. We want to be independent. What's independent? We're going to do it ad hoc. We're going to take every issue on its own and look at it. Take the city of New York. This is one of my favorite examples. Bloomberg. I know Mike Bloomberg. He's a wonderful guy, very smart. He describes himself as a liberal from Boston, but he then registered as a Democrat. But then he registered as a Republican in the next race. Then he registered as an independent in the race after that. And he's never changed a single position. So I think the best thing we can do is kind of tamp down the ideology talk. Talk in terms of specifics, measure every issue on its own. And I think and that's what Obama's doing. And that's what disappoints a lot of the really liberal people who had expectations that he would do certain things because they thought he was liberal. What he's doing is he's being ad hoc. He's taking it an issue at a time and trying to work it practically. And that, if you talk to the politicians here today, you talk to people who are really good at it, like Talkie, he'll tell you that's the way it works, when it works well.
I know you said you didn't want to talk about your son, Andrew Cuomo, and his possible candidacy for governor of New York State, but I'd like to ask you the question, do you think he's going to be a candidate for governor of New York State?
Our time is very short. I'll take one question, a very astute question from the balcony, and one question down, very astute question and short from the floor. All right. No, I'm sorry you got beaten to by the last row. Yeah, well, we're
What position have they taken that frightens you?
the question is asking about.
Hannity and Beck and people like them are saying frightening things. And I ask, what have they said that frightens you? Well, again, I think the numbers don't show that. Now, I'm not a great pollster lover, but it does seem clear to me that more and more people are independent. And the conservatives are not growing that rapidly. Liberals are shrinking, but the conservatives, in the numbers at least, aren't growing. It's the independents who are growing. And the independents don't necessarily like people like Hannity and Beck for exactly the reason you're giving. They're too extreme. And the independents don't like those extremes. And frankly, I'm getting more and more comfortable with the independents.
Okay, the question is about each of our guests as writer and about each guest's next project.
Well, after Abraham Lincoln, it really is hard to figure out what to do next. In fact, each time I move from one subject to the other, I feel like I'm betraying the one who went before. When I had to move all the books out of my library that related to FDR to make room for Lincoln, I felt that FDR would feel somehow I was cheating on. And now I've had to move all my Lincoln books away to make room for Theodore Roosevelt. Again, with Theodore Roosevelt, so many good biographies have been written about him that I can't just write a biography on him. So I'm trying to come at it from two angles. One is to talk about his relationship with William Howard Taft, because they were great friends when they were young men. They met in Washington when Theodore Roosevelt was in the Civil Service Commission and Taft was Solicitor General. They had children the same age. They walked to work together. They were both civil service reformers. They both were sort of young progressives together. And so close did that friendship become that when Roosevelt became president, he offered Taft a chance to become a justice on the Supreme Court, which had been his dream ever since the time he was a young boy. But he was at that time a governor general of the Philippines. He didn't feel he could leave it, so he turned it down. He offered it again, but then at the second time, he still couldn't do it. So he came back and became Secretary of War in charge of the Philippines and becoming Theodore Roosevelt's troubleshooter. At any rate, again, he offered it to him, but his wife at that point, Taft's wife, wanted him to be president and thought he had a chance after Theodore Roosevelt had decided not to run again after 1904. So Roosevelt decides to become Taft's campaign manager, runs his campaign, gives him advice, tells him don't ever be, Taft by this time is weighing 350 pounds, tells him don't be seen on a horse, it looks bad for you and it's dangerous for the horse, tells him don't ever be seen playing golf, it's a dude's game, it's not a working man's game. And he was as nervous for Taft's campaign as he could possibly be. Taft wins, Roosevelt goes to Africa to give him space, and while he's there, he keeps hearing from his progressive friends that Taft is not the progressive that he thought he was. So anyway, making a long story short, he eventually comes back, and I think at the same time wanted to be president again, missed it, he relished it so, decides to run against Taft. The two of them undo each other, ending the progressive wing of the Republican Party, and Woodrow Wilson wins. So it's a really interesting human story. But the other side of the story, which relates to so much of what Mario was saying before, is that what made the progressive movement work at the turn of the 20th century was not simply the leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. He needed the country to be mobilized. He needed active citizens, which is what I thought was going to happen when Obama won his election. And he was able to be helped by that, by an extraordinary journalistic community at that time, which were labeled the muckrakers. They did the investigations that got the citizens caring about food and drug, about railroad abuses, about Standard Oil, Ida Tarbell, Lincoln Steffens, Ray Baker, William Allen White. They've looked back later on their life that this was the most happy time they'd ever had because they knew that their work was changing America. They created the climate of reform that Theodore Roosevelt then gave voice to, and eventually it drowns Taft. And to get back to the present, I mean, I think what's not worked since Obama's presidency is he thought, and we thought, I think much of the country, that it was going to be one of those progressive movements again. He saw the role of government right before he came in as people being more positive toward it than they'd been for 20 years. Polls showed that. He saw another period like the progressive era, like the New Deal, like the Great Society, possibly happening now. And the citizenry has not remained active in the same way that we would have hoped. The journalists don't cover these things anymore. Do we have these kinds of journalists out there? They're too interested in too much of what's going on in the story of the moment, especially when cable television runs the kind of news that we see. So it's hard to keep the citizenry excited and involved in the problems of the day. And so what I'm hoping to do by going back to this era is to just recreate what it was like when you had a good leader like Theodore Roosevelt and you had a country mobilized and change could really happen. Those are the only kind of people I ever want to write about. So I've got another couple. I've been on it about 3 or 4 years. It's not going to be 10 years, but I've got hopefully going to be done by the fall of 11. But that's why it was so fantastic to be up here today, because Bill's friend and now my friend Paul Grundle took me around, and I was able to see the executive mansion where Mario lived. It is so credible. And I saw the Capitol, and I got taken on a terrific tour by the people who are the architects and the tour guides of the Capitol. And it's an incredible city you all have. And I really have a feeling now. I was telling somebody earlier that, you know, the first time I went to Roosevelt's library, you know, just to be able to see, as I said, those, you know, that glasses and that cigarette holder, and imagine that he had actually been there as a man. I couldn't believe he was dead. He had to be coming back to life. That's the way I felt again today. I could feel Teddy Roosevelt. I could feel him in the Capitol. I could feel him in the executive mansion. So beside being here to give tribute to the Writers Institute tonight, I'm so grateful to your city for having recreated for me some feeling for what it was like to be here in the late 19th century once again. Thank you.
I'm working on a book now with Senator Hatch. Hatch is a Mormon who's a Republican. I'm a Roman Catholic who's a Democrat. And the general propositions, or the general questions are, where are we? Where is the nation today? Where should we be? How do we get there? And the first topic on it is, what do you do about the economy? How do we get back up the mountain from where we are economically? What does Hatch say? What does Cuomo say? And then security, and we each give our view on security. And 3 or 4 questions like that. The end question is, when would you be satisfied that, when would you be able to say that this nation is the greatest nation in world history? What would it take to get us there? His view, my view. So it's a combination of 5, 6, or 7 of the major big issues. His point of view, my point of view. One particular topic is ideology. Is it ideal or much less? And his position, my position. It's going to be kind of interesting, I think. I think people will be surprised how it comes out, because I think there's going to be more similarity than difference between the two of us.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Doris Goodwin. And thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you all for coming.